"Don't touch that contract, sir. If you sign it, you're handing them your company." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the boardroom like a crack in glass. For a moment no one moved. The long walnut table gleamed under the white conference lights, reflections of tailored suits and silver pins stretching across its polished surface. At the head of the table sat Richard Halstead, founder and CEO of Halstead Logistics, a man whose decisions moved millions of dollars before lunch and reshaped industries before dinner. His pen hovered an inch above the signature line. Around him, 12 executives froze mid-breath. Slowly, heads turned toward the door. The speaker stood there in a gray janitor's uniform, one hand still resting on the handle of a rolling cleaning cart. Her name tag read simply, Maya. She looked young, maybe 24, dark curls pulled back neatly, blue gloves tucked into the pocket of her apron. For a second the room remained perfectly still, the air thick with the faint scent of lemon disinfectant and fresh printer ink. Then someone laughed. Not kindly. Did the cleaning staff start giving legal advice now? One of the visiting investors muttered, leaning back in his leather chair. A few others smirked. Maya didn't move. She stood with the quiet steadiness of someone who had already decided something important before speaking. Richard Halstead slowly lowered his pen, but didn't sign. His gray eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her, curiosity flickering behind the impatience. "And why exactly?" he asked, voice calm but edged with authority. "Should I listen to someone who came in here to mop the floor?" A faint ripple of chuckles traveled down the table. Maya felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Because the liability clause on page 14 doesn't do what it says it does." The room shifted. One executive straightened in his seat. Another glanced at the thick merger document in front of him. Across the table, Victor Langley, the sharply dressed partner from Langley Global who had drafted the deal, tilted his head with a thin smile. "This is ridiculous," he said lightly. "Security should escort her out before she spills bleach on the contracts." But Richard didn't signal security. Not yet. Instead, he flipped the stack of papers slowly until the small black number 14 appeared in the corner. The soft rustle of pages sounded louder than it should have in the silent room. Maya's heart pounded hard enough she could feel it in her throat, but she kept speaking. "Paragraph C," she said, pointing gently toward the document without stepping closer to the table. "It shifts all post-merger liability to Halstead Logistics if regulatory violations appear later. It reads like a shared responsibility clause, but the wording removes Langley Global from any financial exposure." The investors exchanged glances now. One leaned forward. Another quietly pulled a tablet closer and began scrolling. Victor Langley gave a short, amused breath. "Mr. Halstead," he said, "surely we're not pausing a billion-dollar merger because someone pushing a mop misunderstood legal phrasing." Maya swallowed but didn't look away. "I read it twice," she said. "It's not phrasing. It's a trap." Silence fell again, heavier this time. Outside the glass walls of the 32nd floor conference room, Manhattan traffic crawled along like distant veins of light. Inside, the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard Halstead scanned the clause again, slower now. The faint confidence in Victor Langley's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Young lady," Richard finally said, looking up at Maya, "how exactly does a janitor notice something my legal team didn't?" For the first time since speaking, Maya hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around the metal handle of the cleaning cart. "Because," she said quietly, "before I started cleaning offices, I used to study contracts like this every day." The room went still again. Not the polite silence from before. This one felt different, sharper, heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. The security office smelled faintly of printer toner and lemon disinfectant, the kind used on marble floors after midnight when the building emptied and the quiet became almost sacred. Maya Williams sat perfectly still in the plastic chair across from the small metal desk, her borrowed sneakers resting flat against the cold tile. A wall of surveillance monitors glowed softly above the security guard station, each screen showing silent hallways, elevators, and glass doors reflecting the pale morning light creeping over Manhattan. Her mother, Denise, sat beside her with both hands folded tightly in her lap, the knuckles pale from pressure. Neither of them spoke. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, deliberate beats, each second stretching longer than the last. Maya replayed the moment in the boardroom again and again in her mind. The polished oak table, the expensive suits, the way the air had shifted when she spoke. She had not meant to embarrass anyone. She had only meant to stop a mistake. Yet now the building that had felt so enormous and impersonal during the night shift suddenly felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Denise finally exhaled quietly. Maya, she murmured without looking at her daughter. Next time you see something like that, you just keep walking. Maya's eyes stayed forward, fixed on the reflection of fluorescent light on the marble floor. If he had signed it, Mom, they would have lost everything. Denise rubbed her temple slowly. Honey, people like them do not want warnings from people like us. The words hung in the room like dust in sunlight. Maya knew her mother was not being cruel. She was being realistic. For years, Denise had cleaned offices where executives spoke about billion-dollar deals while never once learning the names of the women who emptied their trash cans. Invisible people were safe people. Invisible people kept their jobs. The security guard cleared his throat quietly and shifted in his chair, but did not interrupt. Outside the small office window, the lobby stretched wide and silent. Polished stone columns rose toward a ceiling of glass panels that caught the pale morning sky. A few early employees passed through the revolving doors, their footsteps echoing softly across the marble. Some glanced toward the security office, curious. Most did not notice it at all. Maya watched them move through the lobby like pieces on a chessboard, confident, certain of where they belonged. She wondered if any of them had ever read every word of the contracts they signed. Another 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, the elevator at the far end of the lobby opened with a quiet chime. 2 men stepped out first, both wearing dark suits and carrying tablets. Behind them walked Jackson Hale. Even from across the lobby, his presence carried weight. He moved with the calm certainty of someone used to rooms falling silent when he entered them. The silver in his hair caught the morning light as he crossed the marble floor. Maya felt Denise stiffen beside her. The door to the security office opened. One of the assistants stepped inside and spoke softly to the guard before glancing toward Maya. Miss Williams, he said carefully as, though testing the sound of her name, Mr. Hale would like to speak with you. Denise's hand instantly closed around Maya's wrist. She is just a kid, Denise said quickly. If she caused trouble, we are sorry. She will not bother anyone again. The assistant shook his head gently. Ma'am, that is not why he wants to see her. Maya stood slowly. Her legs felt steady, even though her heartbeat drummed loudly in her chest. She followed the assistant out into the open lobby where the morning sun now spilled across the marble like a sheet of pale gold. Jackson Hale stood near the center of the floor with a folder in his hand, the same contract from the night before. When Maya approached, he studied her quietly for several seconds. Not with anger, not with amusement, with curiosity. Finally, he opened the folder and tapped a single page with his finger. Page 14, he said calmly. Paragraph C. Maya nodded once. Yes, sir. Jackson's gaze lifted from the paper to her face. The corners of his mouth tightened slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite disbelief. Around them the lobby had grown unusually still, as if the building itself were holding its breath. My legal team reviewed it again this morning, he said. And Miss Williams, he paused for just a moment before finishing the sentence. You were right. The words settled over the marble lobby like a weight that nobody expected to hear. You were right. For a moment Maya thought she had misheard him. The morning light pouring through the tall glass windows turned the floor into a sheet of pale gold, reflecting the 3 figures standing there as if the building itself wanted to witness the moment. Jackson Hale closed the folder slowly, the thick paper inside rustling like a quiet storm that had already passed. Around them a few early employees had slowed their steps, pretending to check phones or adjust briefcases while their eyes behaved the way he expected. My attorneys ran the clause again, he continued, his voice calm, but carrying through the quiet lobby. 3 separate teams reviewed the document before sunrise. He tapped the folder once with the back of his fingers. Every one of them reached the same conclusion you did. Maya felt heat rise slightly in her cheeks, but her voice stayed steady. It was hidden inside the liability shift language, sir. The wording looked routine, but the responsibility changes direction if the merger collapses. Jackson tilted his head slightly. You read legal contracts often, Miss Williams? The question was not mocking. It was genuine curiosity. Maya hesitated for only a second. Sometimes, sir. My grandfather used to collect business journals. I read them when I was younger. Jackson's silver eyebrows lifted a fraction. Business journals. One of the assistants standing nearby shifted awkwardly, unsure whether he was witnessing a compliment or a problem. The building air system hummed softly above them. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator chimed. Denise finally stepped forward, her voice tight with worry. Mr. Hale, sir, Maya meant no disrespect. She is a good girl. She reads too much. Jackson turned his attention toward Denise, and for a brief moment the edge of authority softened in his expression. Mrs. Williams, your daughter may have saved my company several $100 million last night. The words seemed to echo off the marble columns. Denise blinked, stunned into silence. Maya shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention gathering around them. A security guard walked past pretending to check a hallway camera, but clearly listening. Jackson opened the folder again and slid a single sheet free. The page rustled quietly in the open air. Tell me something, Maya, he said, using her first name now. When you stepped into that boardroom last night, surrounded by executives, lawyers, and investors, did you expect anyone to believe you? Maya looked at the floor for a moment where the sunlight traced thin lines across the marble tiles. Then she lifted her eyes again. No, sir. Jackson's gaze sharpened. Then why say anything at all? Maya answered without hesitation. Because the paper did not care who read it. It only cared whether someone noticed. The assistant nearest them inhaled quietly. Jackson stared at her for several seconds, studying the calm certainty in her voice. Something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a man adjusting his understanding of a situation that no longer fit the old rules. Finally, he slipped the contract page back into the folder. Interesting answer, he murmured. Across the lobby, a group of junior analysts had gathered near the coffee stand, whispering to one another while pretending not to stare. The morning energy of the building was waking up around them, yet the small circle in the center of the floor still felt strangely suspended in time. Jackson turned slightly toward one of his assistants. Cancel the 9:30 merger call. The assistant blinked in surprise. Sir. Jackson nodded once. Reschedule it for this afternoon. Then he looked back at Maya. Because before I sign anything in this building again, his voice lowered slightly, thoughtful now rather than commanding. I would like the girl who caught the mistake to show me exactly how she found it. The request hung in the air like the quiet moment before a storm breaks. Because before I sign anything in this building again, I would like the girl who caught the mistake to show me exactly how she found it. The lobby seemed to pause around them. Maya felt every pair of eyes that had slowly gathered across the marble floor. Analysts with paper cups of coffee. Assistants pretending to scroll through their phones. A security guard who had suddenly become very interested in adjusting a camera that did not need adjusting. Denise's breath caught softly behind her daughter. Maya did not move at first. Not because she was afraid, but because the request itself felt unreal. A few hours earlier, she had been wiping fingerprints from glass conference doors while her mother vacuumed carpet lines down the hallway. Now the man whose name sat on the front of the building was asking her to walk back into the boardroom. Jackson Hale waited calmly. He was not impatient. He simply stood there with the quiet confidence of someone used to decisions reshaping the day around him. Finally, Maya nodded once. Yes, sir, she said softly. Jackson gestured toward the private elevator at the far end of the lobby. Then let us go upstairs. The small group moved across the marble floor, their footsteps echoing lightly under the high ceiling. Denise hesitated near the security desk, unsure if she should follow. Jackson noticed and paused. Mrs. Williams, he said, turning slightly. You may come as well if you wish. Denise looked stunned, then nodded quickly and hurried to catch up beside her daughter. The elevator doors opened with a smooth whisper. Inside, brushed steel walls reflected their figures in soft distortions. The ride upward was silent except for the quiet hum of cables lifting them through the tower. Floor numbers glowed one by one above the door. 21, 22, 23. By the time the elevator reached the 27th floor, Maya's heartbeat had steadied again. When the doors opened, the familiar hallway stretched ahead of them, lined with glass walls and polished wood panels that carried the faint scent of furniture polish and fresh coffee. A few executives standing near the conference room stopped mid-conversation when they saw Jackson approaching with the young girl from the night before. Surprise flickered across several faces. One man quickly straightened his tie. Another quietly stepped aside. Jackson pushed open the conference room door. The long oak table waited inside exactly as it had hours earlier, the contract folders still resting at each seat like silent witnesses. Morning sunlight streamed through the wall of windows, casting long reflections across the polished surface. Jackson placed the folder in front of Maya and pulled out the chair at the head of the table. "Show me," he said simply. Maya remained standing. The chair felt too large, too formal, and sitting in it would make her feel like she was pretending to be something she was not. Instead, she opened the contract and flipped carefully through the pages until she reached the section she remembered. The paper rustled quietly in the still room. Several executives slowly drifted into the doorway behind them, curiosity stronger than caution. Maya traced one finger down the column of text until she found the line again. "Here," she said. Jackson leaned closer, reading along with her. Maya spoke slowly, clearly, the way her grandfather had taught her when explaining things that mattered. The language says the acquiring firm accepts post-merger compliance liabilities if operational oversight transfers before regulatory confirmation. Jackson nodded slightly. "That sounds standard." Maya moved her finger one line lower. "But this sentence changes the direction of responsibility. It says the acquiring firm assumes liabilities even if oversight never transfers." One of the attorneys standing behind them leaned forward sharply. Jackson read the sentence again, more carefully this time. The room grew quieter with every second. Maya continued. "That means if anything goes wrong after the deal closes, even if the other company caused it, your firm still carries the legal exposure." Jackson's jaw tightened just slightly. One of the lawyers whispered under his breath, "That is not a standard clause." Maya stepped back from the table, giving the paper space to speak for itself. The sunlight caught the edge of the page, illuminating the small line of text that had nearly changed the future of the entire company. Jackson remained silent for several long seconds. Then he straightened slowly and looked around the room at the executives who had gathered in the doorway. His voice was calm, but it carried across the entire conference room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly, "this building almost signed away its future last night." He turned his gaze back to Maya, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no distance in his voice when he spoke. "Thank you for noticing." The quiet in the conference room did not disappear after Jackson Hale spoke. Instead, it deepened, settling into the corners of the glass walls and the polished oak table like something heavy that everyone could feel but no one wanted to disturb. Maya stood beside the chair she had never sat in, her hands resting loosely at her sides. The page of the contract remained open in front of Jackson, sunlight pouring across the small line of text that had almost gone unnoticed by an entire team of professionals. Behind them, more executives had gathered in the doorway. Some leaned against the glass wall. Others stood with their arms crossed, reading the clause again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less embarrassing. Denise remained near the back of the room, clutching the edge of her cleaning cloth like a quiet anchor. She had spent years cleaning conference tables just like this one, wiping away coffee rings and fingerprints after meetings ended. Never once had she imagined standing inside one while executives listened to her daughter explain a contract. Jackson finally closed the folder with a slow, deliberate motion. The sound of the paper settling inside echoed softly in the large room. He turned slightly toward the group gathered behind him. "I want every document Von Global has sent us in the past. 30 days reviewed again," he said calmly, line by line. One of the senior attorneys nodded quickly and stepped forward, already tapping instructions into a tablet. The energy in the room shifted from shock to movement. People began speaking in low voices. Phones appeared in hands. A quiet storm of professional damage control began to ripple through the group. Yet Jackson did not move. His attention remained on Maya. For several seconds, he studied her with the thoughtful silence of a man revising a conclusion he had formed too quickly the night before. "How old are you?" he asked finally. Maya blinked once at the sudden simplicity of the question. 16, sir." A murmur passed through the executives near the doorway. Someone whispered something under their breath that sounded very close to disbelief. Jackson nodded slowly, absorbing the number as though it added a new dimension to the moment. 16, he repeated quietly. His eyes drifted briefly toward the tall windows overlooking the city skyline before returning to her. At 16, most people in this building were still trying to understand basic accounting. One of the junior analysts shifted uncomfortably at that comment. Maya did not smile. Praise had never been something she knew how to carry easily. Jackson leaned one hand against the edge of the table. Tell me something honestly, he said. When security escorted you out last night, what did you think would happen next? Maya looked at the polished floor for a moment where the sunlight reflected thin bands of brightness between the chair legs. I thought we might lose our cleaning contract, she answered simply. The room fell quiet again. Denise lowered her eyes slightly, embarrassed by how ordinary that answer sounded inside a room built for billion-dollar decisions. Jackson exhaled slowly through his nose. You risked your family's income to warn people who would not even know your name. Maya lifted her shoulders slightly in a small shrug. The contract did not care about names, sir. A faint smile touched the corner of Jackson's mouth. It was not the polished public smile that appeared in financial magazines. It was quieter than that, more thoughtful. He looked around the room once more, then back at the girl standing beside the table. Miss Williams, he said, his tone shifting into something more deliberate. Most people in this industry spend decades learning how to notice details. Like the one you found. He paused for a moment, allowing the silence to settle around the words. You noticed it while walking past a copier. A few of the lawyers exchanged glances. The truth of that detail was impossible to ignore. Jackson stepped away from the table and walked toward the window, the skyline of Manhattan stretching across the glass like a map of ambition. When he spoke again, his voice carried calmly across the room. Sometimes the most valuable insight does not come from the highest chair in the room. He turned back toward Maya, studying her with a new kind of focus. Sometimes it comes from the person everyone else assumed would stay silent. The sunlight shifted across the table as a cloud passed outside, briefly dimming the room before brightening again. Jackson returned to the head of the table and placed both hands lightly on the wood surface. Miss Williams, he said carefully, I would like to ask you something else. The executives in the doorway leaned slightly closer without realizing it. Even Denise held her breath. Jackson's voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable seriousness in it now. Have you ever considered working somewhere other than the night shift cleaning crew in this building? The question lingered in the air like the quiet echo of a bell. Have you ever considered working somewhere other than the night shift cleaning crew in this building? Maya did not answer immediately. The words felt larger than the room itself, heavier than the glass walls and the long oak table where executives now stood pretending to study documents while listening closely to every second of silence. Sunlight slid across the polished surface of the table, tracing thin reflections along the contract page that had nearly changed the company's future. Maya's eyes lowered briefly to the floor as she considered the question. For years her world had been measured in simple routines. Midnight train rides into Manhattan. The hum of vacuum cleaners in quiet hallways. The faint smell of bleach and lemon cleaner that clung to her hands long after the shift ended. She had never imagined someone like Jackson Hale asking her about her future. Denise shifted nervously behind her daughter. She understood the danger hidden inside opportunities like this. People in powerful rooms sometimes spoke generously in the moment, but the real world outside those rooms rarely changed. Overnight, Maya finally lifted her head again. I have thought about it, sir, she said quietly. Jackson watched her carefully, and Maya took a slow breath. Thinking and having the chance are not always the same thing. The words settled across the conference room like a soft truth that nobody could argue with. One of the junior lawyers lowered his eyes to the floor. Jackson nodded once, acknowledging the honesty in the answer. Fair point, he said. He walked slowly along the side of the table, his hands resting lightly behind his back as he moved. The skyline beyond the windows shimmered under the late morning sun. For a moment, he looked less like a chief executive and more like someone studying a puzzle that had unexpectedly revealed a new piece. You read contracts, he continued calmly. You understand risk language most college graduates struggle with. And you saw something an entire legal team missed. He stopped near the end of the table and looked directly at her. That tells me two things. The room grew quiet again. Even the executives standing in the hallway had stopped pretending not to listen. Jackson raised one finger slightly. First, You have an unusual eye for detail. Then he lifted a second finger. Second, you are not afraid to speak when something is wrong. Maya shifted slightly where she stood. Praise still made her uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that did not quite belong to her yet. Jackson's voice softened just enough to sound less like a corporate announcement and more like a personal thought spoken aloud. Both of those qualities are rare. Denise felt her chest tighten slightly. She had worked long enough in wealthy offices to recognize when a moment was beginning to change direction. Jackson returned to the head of the table and rested one hand lightly on the contract folder. Miss Williams, he said, choosing his words carefully now. Hale Investments runs a summer mentorship program for young students interested in finance, law, and business analysis. Several of the executives exchanged surprised glances. The program usually accepted college juniors from elite universities. Jackson continued without acknowledging their reactions. Participants normally come from Ivy League schools or business academies. His eyes remained on Maya. But rules are written for normal situations. He opened the folder again and removed a blank note card from inside. The white card looked almost impossibly simple. Against the dark wood of the table, he wrote a few words on it with a silver pen, then slid it gently across the surface toward Maya. That card has the direct email from my chief legal officer, he said calmly. If you are willing, I would like you to meet with her this week. Maya looked down at the small card resting in front of her. The ink shimmered slightly in the sunlight. For a moment, she did not reach for it. The distance between her hand and the card felt like crossing an invisible line between two different versions of her life. Jackson did not rush her. He simply waited. Finally, Maya picked up the card carefully, holding it between her fingers like something fragile but important. Jackson nodded once. You would not be joining as a cleaner, he added quietly. You would be there to learn. Denise's eyes filled with silent disbelief. Around the room, the executives stood in thoughtful silence, watching a moment that none of them had planned but all of them understood. The girl who had walked into the building through the service entrance the night before was now standing at the head of the same table where billion-dollar decisions were made, holding a single white card that might change everything. The white card felt strangely heavy in Maya's hand, even though it weighed almost nothing. The ink of the email address shimmered faintly under the sunlight streaming through the tall conference room windows, as if the letters themselves carried a kind of quiet electricity. Around the table, the executives slowly returned to motion, though their movements were careful now, thoughtful in a way that had not existed earlier that morning. Phones buzzed softly. Someone whispered instructions to an assistant in the hallway, but the center of the room still felt suspended around the girl holding the card. Denise stepped forward cautiously, her eyes moving between the card and the man who had just offered it. For years, she had pushed a vacuum cleaner through these same hallways while listening to conversations about mergers and markets and investment strategies that sounded like a language spoken on another planet. Now that world had turned its attention toward her daughter. Sir, Denise said quietly, her voice careful with respect. This is very generous, but Maya still has school. Jackson Hale nodded immediately, as if the concern had already crossed his mind. And she should finish it, he said without hesitation. Education is not something anyone should skip. His tone was calm, but firm, like someone stating a rule he believed in deeply. He gestured lightly toward the skyline outside the windows where Manhattan stretched across the horizon in towers of glass and steel. This city is built by people who learned how to think carefully before they learned how to earn money. Maya listened quietly, the card still between her fingers. Jackson turned his attention back to her. The mentorship would not replace school, he explained. It would simply allow you to spend some afternoons here learning how decisions in rooms like this are made. One of the senior attorneys cleared his throat softly, finally stepping farther into the room. Mr. Hale, he said cautiously, the program normally has a selection process. Jackson looked at him briefly, his expression calm but unmistakably decisive. Yes, he replied. And today we selected someone. The attorney nodded once and said nothing more. Maya felt a faint warmth rise in her chest that she did not quite know how to name. Opportunity was a word she had read many times in articles and books, but it had always seemed to belong to people whose lives looked very different from hers. Jackson leaned one shoulder lightly against the table, studying her expression. You do not have to decide today, he said. Opportunities should be considered carefully. the same way contracts should be read carefully. A few of the executives exchanged small smiles at that comparison. Maya looked down again at the white card. Her grandfather's voice echoed quietly in her memory, the way he used to say that knowledge was like a flashlight in a dark room. It did not change the room, but it helped you see where you were walking. She slipped the card gently into the front pocket of her hoodie. I would like to try, she said softly. Jackson nodded once, satisfied not by the enthusiasm in her voice, but by the calm thought behind it. Good, he said simply. Across the room, Denise wiped a small tear from the corner of her eye and quickly pretended she had something in her eye. Jackson noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he closed the contract folder and handed it to one of the waiting attorneys. Remove the clause and schedule the meeting again for tomorrow, he instructed. And send Vaughn Global a message that we read every word before signing anything. The attorney nodded and stepped away. The small crowd in the doorway slowly dispersed, carrying quiet whispers down the hallway like a story that would travel through the entire building before lunchtime. Maya moved toward the door beside her mother, the conference room suddenly feeling larger and quieter than before. As she stepped into the hallway, she glanced back once more. Jackson Hale had already turned toward the window again, looking out over the city as if the skyline itself were another contract waiting to be studied carefully. The sunlight caught the glass towers beyond the building, reflecting 1,000 bright points across the sky. Maya walked toward the elevator beside her mother, the card resting safely in her pocket, a small piece of paper that did not change the world but might quietly change the path she would walk through it. The elevator doors closed with a soft metallic whisper, sealing Maya and Denise inside a narrow space lined with brushed steel walls. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the elevator cables filled the silence as the car began descending slowly through the tower. 27 glowed above the door. Then 26. Denise finally exhaled, the breath leaving her chest as if she had been holding it since the moment they stepped into the conference room. She turned toward her daughter, studying her face carefully as though making sure the girl standing beside her was still the same one who had ridden the subway to night shifts and shared instant noodles at 2 a.m. Maya, she whispered, her voice carrying equal parts pride and worry. Do you understand what just happened in there? Maya leaned lightly against the cool metal wall and slipped her hands into the pockets of her hoodie. Her fingers brushed the edge of the small white card resting inside. The paper felt warm now, holding the quiet weight of possibility. I think so, she answered softly. The elevator chimed once as the numbers continued to fall. 24. 23. Denise shook her head slowly, half amazed and half afraid. People like Mr. Hale do not usually notice people like us, she said. Not like that. Maya nodded slightly. She understood what her mother meant. For years their lives had moved along the edges of rooms where powerful decisions were made. Invisible workers polishing the glass after the conversations ended. But something had shifted this morning. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to tilt the direction of the day. The elevator reached the lobby level with a soft chime. When the doors opened, the building felt different than it had a few hours earlier. The marble floor reflected brighter daylight now, and the lobby buzzed quietly with the rhythm of the workday beginning. Analysts hurried toward elevators carrying tablets. Reception phones rang in short bursts. Security guards nodded politely as employees passed through the front entrance. Yet as Maya and Denise stepped out of the elevator, a few heads turned. The story had already begun to travel through the building like a ripple across still water. A receptionist glanced up from her desk with curious eyes. 2 junior analysts whispered to each other near the coffee station. Maya felt the attention but did not react to it. She simply walked beside her mother toward the service corridor that led to the maintenance rooms and supply closets where their night shift usually began. Denise finally stopped near the hallway entrance and turned toward her daughter again. You still have school in the morning, she said gently, as if grounding the moment back in reality. And tonight we still have work. Maya nodded once. Yes, Mom. Denise studied her for another second, then reached out and squeezed Maya's shoulder. Just promise me something. What? Denise's voice softened. Do not let this building change who you are. Maya smiled slightly at that. It will not, she said. The quiet confidence in her voice surprised even Denise. Across the lobby, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, washing the marble floor in warm light. Outside, the The streets of Manhattan moved with their usual endless rhythm of taxis and buses and pedestrians crossing intersections without noticing the thousands of stories unfolding around them. Maya slipped the white card from her pocket and looked at it again for a moment. The ink of the email address had already dried completely, but the words seemed to carry a quiet promise inside them. Denise glanced at the card too, then shook her head in disbelief. "You know," she murmured. "Last night you were arguing with me about whether we could afford new sneakers before school starts." Maya laughed softly under her breath. The sound felt light in the bright lobby air. She tucked the card safely back into her pocket. "We still might not be able to," she replied. Denise laughed too, the tension finally breaking. For a moment, they simply stood together in the middle of the busy lobby, mother and daughter surrounded by the quiet thunder of a building waking up to a new day. Then Denise gestured toward the service hallway. "Come on," she said. "Your shift may have ended, but mine has not." Maya nodded and followed her mother down the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, the familiar scent of cleaning supplies drifting through the air like a reminder of where they had come from. Yet as Maya walked beside her mother, the white card in her pocket felt like a small door had opened somewhere ahead of her, waiting quietly for the moment she would decide to step through it. The service corridor was quieter than the marble lobby, the bright corporate energy fading into the softer rhythm of maintenance carts and humming fluorescent lights. Maya walked beside her mother past the narrow storage rooms where shelves of paper towels, cleaning sprays, and folded uniforms were stacked in careful rows. The smell of lemon cleaner and warm air from the ventilation system wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. For years this hallway had been the true center of their workdays, the place where conversations happened in low voices and people rested their feet for a few minutes between long stretches of cleaning offices that did not belong to them. Denise pushed open the small break room door and stepped inside. The room was simple, with a metal table, a humming refrigerator, and a coffee maker that looked older than the building itself. She set her cleaning cloth on the table and sat down slowly, still shaking her head, as if the morning had not fully settled into reality yet. Maya leaned against the counter and poured a small cup of water from the sink. The paper card in her pocket brushed against her fingers again, reminding her that the moment upstairs had not been a dream. Denise finally looked up at her daughter with a careful expression. "When I first started cleaning offices in this city," she said quietly, "I used to read the names on the doors and wonder what it must feel like to sit behind those desks." Maya listened without interrupting. Denise smiled faintly. "After a while you stop wondering. You just focus on doing your job well." The refrigerator motor clicked softly as it turned on again. Maya took a sip of water and sat across from her mother at the metal table. "Grandpa used to say something different," she said gently. Denise raised an eyebrow. "What was that?" Maya folded her hands together, remembering the quiet evenings when her grandfather would sit beside a small desk lamp surrounded by stacks of magazines and newspapers. He said that the difference between the people who sign the contracts and the people who clean the offices is not always intelligence, she explained. Sometimes it is just opportunity. Denise considered that for a moment. "Your grandfather also believed you could fix a broken radio with a spoon and patience." Maya laughed softly. The tension in the room lifted slightly. Just then the break room door opened, and another member of the night cleaning crew stepped inside, carrying a small cart of supplies. Carmen, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a quick smile, paused when she saw them sitting there. "You two look like you just won the lottery," she joked. Denise let out a small breath. "Something like that." Carmen poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "The whole lobby is buzzing," she said. "They say the boss himself brought a girl back upstairs this morning because she saved some huge deal." She glanced playfully toward Maya. "Imagine that." Maya shrugged slightly, but could not hide the quiet smile forming on her face. Carmen studied her expression for a moment. Then her eyes widened in slow realization. "Wait," she said softly. "Do not tell me." Denise nodded once. Carmen's mouth opened in surprise. "Girl," she whispered, setting her coffee cup down carefully. "What did you do?" Maya hesitated, unsure how to explain something that had unfolded so quickly. "I just read something carefully," she answered. Carmen let out a low whistle. "In this building that is practically a superpower." All three women laughed quietly, the sound filling the small break room with warmth. Outside the door, the corridor buzzed faintly with the routine sounds of the building beginning another busy day. Carmen finally shook her head in amazement. Well, she said, picking up her card again. If the people upstairs start asking questions about contracts, I know who I am calling. She pushed the card out into the hallway, still smiling to herself. Denise looked back at her daughter, her expression softer now. You see, she said gently. Sometimes the world notices when someone pays attention. Maya slipped her hand into her pocket again, feeling the smooth edge of the white card resting there. The future still looked uncertain, still full of long nights and early mornings and subway rides across the city. But somewhere beyond the service corridor and the humming lights and the smell of cleaning supplies, another door had quietly opened, waiting for the moment she would step through it. The break room slowly returned to its normal rhythm after Carmen rolled her cart back into the hallway. The humming refrigerator, the ticking wall clock, and the faint echo of footsteps from the corridor filled the quiet space again. Denise sat at the metal table for a moment longer, her fingers tracing the edge of the cleaning cloth beside her as if she were still piecing together everything that had happened upstairs. Maya stood by the sink looking through the small window that faced the back alley behind the building. Delivery trucks were unloading crates near the service entrance, and a man in a reflective vest pushed a cart stacked with boxes across the concrete. It was the same ordinary view she had seen dozens of times before, yet today the light seemed a little brighter, the city a little wider. Denise finally stood up and stretched her shoulders. We should head home soon, she said gently. You still need a few hours of sleep before school. Maya nodded but did not move right away. Her hand slipped into her hoodie pocket again, touching the white card like a small compass pointing somewhere unfamiliar. Denise noticed and smiled faintly. You keep checking that card like it might disappear. Maya laughed softly. It just feels strange. Denise picked up her cleaning cloth and folded it neatly. Strange is not always bad, she replied. Sometimes strange is how new paths begin. They stepped back into the service corridor together. The fluorescent lights cast long pale reflections on the polished concrete floor as they walked toward the rear exit that led to the subway station 2 blocks away. A few members of the maintenance crew passed them in the hallway, offering quiet nods and curious smiles. The story had clearly spread faster than either of them expected. Near the service elevator, Mr. Jenkins, the night shift supervisor, stood reviewing a clipboard. He looked up as they approached, his expression unusually serious. Maya, he said slowly. Denise's shoulders stiffened slightly, expecting a reprimand or a warning about company rules. Instead, Mr. Jenkins studied Maya for a moment, then gave a short nod. Word is you caught something the lawyers missed. Maya shifted her weight slightly. I just noticed a sentence that looked unusual. Mr. Jenkins scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, he said after a moment, most people do not read contracts while they are emptying trash cans. A faint smile crept across his face. Good work. Denise blinked in surprise. Mr. Jenkins was not a man known for handing out compliments easily. He checked his clipboard again, then waved them toward the exit. Go home and get some rest, he said. This building will still be here tonight. Maya thanked him quietly and pushed open the heavy service door. Warm daylight rushed in from the street outside, carrying the sounds of traffic and distant horns. The city moved at its usual restless pace, unaware of the small story unfolding inside the building behind them. Denise stepped onto the sidewalk and inhaled deeply. You know, she said, glancing at the tall glass tower rising above them. I have cleaned offices in that building for almost 12 years. Maya followed her gaze upward. The windows of the upper floors reflected the bright morning sky like mirrors. Somewhere up there, Jackson Hale was probably already back in another meeting, another decision, another contract waiting to be examined. Denise shook her head slightly. And today my daughter walked into the boardroom like she belonged there. Maya smiled gently. I did not belong there. Denise turned toward her with quiet certainty in her eyes. Maybe not yesterday, she said. But today you did. They began walking toward the subway entrance at the corner of the block. Pedestrians hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases, the rhythm of Manhattan carrying everyone forward. Maya slipped her hand into her pocket one more time and felt the smooth edge of the card. The future still looked uncertain, still shaped by school schedules and night shifts and crowded subway cars. But now there was also a small line of ink on a white card, An invitation written in careful handwriting that proved something Maya had always believed quietly inside her mind. Sometimes the difference between standing outside a door and walking through it was simply the courage to notice something everyone else overlooked. The subway entrance swallowed the noise of the street as Maya and Denise stepped down the worn concrete stairs. The city above continued its endless rhythm of horns and footsteps, but underground the sound changed into the deep metallic echoes of trains arriving and leaving the platform. Warm air rolled through the tunnel, carrying the scent of steel rails and electricity. Maya walked beside her mother toward the platform, slipping her metro card through the turnstile with a familiar click. It was the same commute she had taken countless mornings after finishing a night shift. Yet today, every sound seemed sharper, every detail clearer, as if her mind was still replaying the morning upstairs in the glass tower. Denise stood beside her on the platform and adjusted the strap of her worn work bag. For a moment, she simply watched the tunnel lights flicker in the distance. "Your grandfather would have liked today," she said quietly. Maya smiled at that. "He would have told me I still missed 3 other mistakes in that contract." Denise laughed softly. "Yes, that sounds exactly like him." The train thundered into the station a minute later, slowing with a long metallic sigh. The doors slid open and passengers stepped aside as Maya and Denise found 2 empty seats near the window. The train lurched forward, carrying them away from the financial district and toward the quieter neighborhoods where their apartment waited above a small grocery store. Maya rested her head lightly against the cool glass and watched the tunnel lights blur past. The card in her pocket pressed gently against her side, a quiet reminder that the day had not ended the way it began. After a few stops, Denise glanced toward her daughter again. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I was your age I never imagined people like Mr. Hale would ever listen to someone like me." Maya turned slightly in her seat. "He listened because the contract was wrong," she replied. Denise nodded. "Maybe, but a lot of people saw that same contract and did not notice." Maya considered that for a moment. Grandpa always said most people read words, but they do not really see them. The train rattled over a set of tracks, the sound echoing through the car like distant thunder. Across from them, a man in a gray suit typed quickly on his phone, completely unaware that the girl sitting 2 seats away had quietly saved a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The normalcy of the moment felt strangely comforting. Life had not suddenly transformed into something dramatic or loud. It was still the same train, the same neighborhoods sliding past the windows, the same long days waiting ahead. When the train reached their stop, Maya and Denise stepped onto the platform and climbed the narrow staircase toward the street. Morning sunlight poured across the sidewalk as they emerged into the neighborhood. Small shops were opening their doors. A bakery on the corner filled the air with the warm scent of fresh bread. The grocery store owner downstairs from their apartment waved as they passed. "Long night," he called out cheerfully. Denise smiled. "Something like that." They climbed the creaking wooden stairs to their apartment. Inside, the small space was quiet and familiar, filled with the soft hum of a window fan and the faint smell of laundry detergent. Denise placed her bag on the kitchen table and turned toward Maya. "Get some sleep before school," she said gently. Maya nodded but paused for a moment beside the window, looking out at the neighborhood rooftops stretching into the distance. The white card was still in her pocket. She pulled it out slowly and read the email address again, the ink steady and simple on the smooth paper. It did not promise success. It did not guarantee anything, but it offered a chance to step into a world she had only ever seen from the outside. Denise watched her quietly from across the room. "Are you going to write to her?" she asked softly. Maya slipped the card back into her pocket and turned toward her mother with a calm expression. "Yes," she said. Denise raised an eyebrow. "Today?" Maya nodded once. "Tonight," she replied. "After school." Denise smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and cautious hope in her eyes. Outside the apartment window, the city continued moving through its endless morning routine, unaware that somewhere inside a small apartment, above a grocery store, a 16-year-old girl was already beginning to walk through the door that had opened quietly for her the day before. That evening the apartment felt unusually quiet. The small kitchen light cast a warm circle across the wooden table where Maya sat with her school laptop open in front of her. Outside the window the neighborhood had settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm. A bus hissed to a stop on the corner. Somewhere down the street a radio played softly from an open storefront. The smell of warm bread from the bakery downstairs drifted through the air like a comforting reminder that life was still ordinary even when something important had begun to change. Maya rested her elbows on the table and stared at the blank email screen for a long moment. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting. Denise moved quietly in the kitchen behind her, rinsing a coffee mug and setting it in the drying rack. She did not interrupt. She understood that some moments needed space to unfold naturally. Maya slipped the white card from her pocket and placed it on the table beside the laptop. The neat handwriting of the email address looked exactly the same as it had that morning in the conference room, but now it felt different. Upstairs in that glass tower, it had seemed like an invitation. Sitting here in their small apartment, it felt like the first step of a long road she had not yet learned how to walk. Denise dried her hands on a kitchen towel and sat down across from her daughter. "Still thinking about what to write?" she asked gently. Maya nodded. "I do not want to sound like I am pretending to be someone I am not." Denise smiled softly. "Then do not pretend." Maya looked up from the screen. Denise leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and steady. "Just tell the truth about who you are and why you noticed that clause." Maya thought about that for a moment. Her grandfather's voice echoed quietly in her memory again, reminding her that the clearest explanations were always the simplest ones. She placed her fingers on the keyboard and began to type slowly. "Dear Ms. Carter, my name is Maya Williams. Mr. Jackson Hale suggested I contact you after reviewing a contract earlier today. I am a student and I currently help my mother on the night cleaning shift in your building. I noticed a liability clause that seemed unusual, and Mr. Hale mentioned that you might be willing to explain more about how your team analyzes contracts. I would be grateful for the chance to learn." Maya paused and read the message again. It was not fancy. It was not written in the complicated language she had seen in legal documents. But it was honest. Denise nodded approvingly. "That sounds exactly like you." Maya took a slow breath and clicked send. The email vanished from the screen in an instant, flying quietly across invisible wires toward the glass tower downtown. For a moment, she simply sat there, listening to the faint hum of the laptop and the distant sounds of the city outside the window. Denise stood up and squeezed her shoulder gently. "Now it is done." Maya nodded. The step had been small, but it felt important. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. "Grandpa always said opportunities do not usually knock loudly," she murmured. Denise chuckled softly. "No, most of the time they whisper." Across the city, in a quiet office on the 27th floor of the glass tower, the cleaning crew had already begun their evening shift. The lights of Manhattan shimmered beyond the tall windows like scattered stars. And somewhere inside the company network, a simple email from a 16-year-old girl named Maya Williams appeared quietly in the inbox of the chief legal officer of Hale Investments, waiting to be opened the next morning. Morning light slid slowly across the small kitchen table as Maya stepped into the apartment after school the next day. The afternoon sun filtered through the window above the sink, warming the faded wood surface where her laptop still rested from the night before. For a moment, she simply stood there with her backpack hanging from one shoulder, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood drifting up from the street. Denise was not home yet. Her mother had taken an extra daytime shift cleaning offices across town, hoping to cover the rising cost of rent before the end of the month. Maya set her backpack on the chair and walked toward the table. The laptop screen flickered awake when she lifted the lid. Her heart began beating a little faster. Before the inbox even finished loading, she had not expected an answer so quickly, but there it was. One new message. The sender line read, "Rebecca Carter, Chief Legal Officer, Hale Investments." Maya stared at the name for several seconds as if confirming it was real. The cursor hovered over the message. Then she clicked. The email opened with calm, professional simplicity. "Dear Maya Williams, Mr. Hale mentioned you might contact me. I reviewed the clause you identified in the merger document this morning. Your observation was correct, and more importantly, your reasoning was precise. I would be happy to meet with you this Friday afternoon to discuss how our legal team analyzes contract risk. If you are still interested in learning, please come to the 27th floor at 3 o'clock. Maya leaned back slowly in her chair, reading the message again just to be certain she had not imagined it. The words were simple, but they carried the quiet weight of recognition. Someone inside that glass tower had read her email and answered it seriously. She glanced toward the window where the city stretched across the late afternoon light. Taxis rolled past the corner bakery. A delivery driver stacked boxes outside the grocery store downstairs. The world continued exactly as it had yesterday, yet something inside her felt different. Not louder, not dramatic, just steadier. Denise arrived home about 20 minutes later, pushing the apartment door open with tired shoulders and a grocery bag tucked under one arm. "I brought bread from the bakery," she called out as she stepped inside. They had a discount at closing. Maya turned the laptop toward her mother without saying a word. Denise set the bag down slowly and leaned closer to read the screen. Her eyes moved across the message once. Then again, a quiet smile spread across her face. "Well," she murmured softly. "Looks like someone listened." Maya nodded. Friday at 3. Denise sat down at the table, still reading the email as if the words might disappear if she blinked too quickly. "Your grandfather would have framed that message," she said with a gentle laugh. Maya closed the laptop carefully. "He would have told me this is only the beginning." Denise looked at her daughter with the calm certainty of someone who had spent years watching potential grow quietly in the background. He would be right about that. 2. Evening light slowly filled the apartment as the sun lowered behind the buildings across the street. The small room glowed warm and peaceful, the same way it had on hundreds of ordinary evenings before. Yet now a new moment waited quietly at the end of the week. A meeting on the 27th floor of a tower where decisions shaped companies and futures. Maya walked to the window and looked out across the neighborhood rooftops. The city stretched endlessly toward the horizon, thousands of lights beginning to flicker on one by one. She slipped the white card from her pocket again and held it for a moment, remembering the conference room, the sunlight across the contract page, and the simple question that had started everything. Sometimes the world changes loudly, but sometimes it changes in a single quiet moment when someone notices what everyone else missed and decides to speak anyway.